lesson 24 is about poetry, and the title is Poetry Works. So we're going to be talking a little bit about why it's important to at least have a little handle on how poetry works, because it's very valuable for other skills that you may have in life. The other option, of course, is that you may like poetry once you figure out that it's a puzzle. A poet gives you a poem with very distinct word choices and is basically giving you their impression of something and how it makes them feel. So it's like a painting. Think of the paintings you've seen. Some are very obvious, but others are hard to understand because of the technique used and things like that. So if you take some time with a poem, you can usually get something that is relevant to you. Every artist, every poet wants to be understood, and wants to have their work of art, and I call a poem a work of art. They want it to mean something to the general public, the people that see a poem. So Bob and I are going to talk a little bit about some of our favorite poems, and the reason we should do poetry in an English class, for instance. And then we're going to show you some samples of springtime poems. We thought there's a whole range of genre of poetry, but we thought with spring here, why not have something pretty to look at and see if it's just about nature and things like that. So, Bob, did you have a poem that you were looking at this week?
There's a couple. One of the poems that I've always liked is Robert Frost's Two Roads in the Woods, The Two Roads in the Woods. I've used that one a lot in my teaching. It's a nice piece of poetry. And then this morning I go online and looking, and I saw the My Captain poem by Walt Whitman, and I never realized that poem was written after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And the captain refers to Lincoln. So that was something new that I found out, and I've heard that poem before, and it is one that I do like.
Yeah, and I think that's a good representative of the fact that the poem itself, it has a lot of references to the ship and things like that. So you're thinking of a captain of a ship,
Yeah.
you know. But again, as there's always this other meaning in poetry, and I assume he was thinking of Lincoln as being the ship of state, meaning the country,
Right.
and once he was gone, we would be shipwrecked, maybe, you know, or something like that, you know. But it is a beautiful poem, and it's one. And I must say, when I was in school, and probably you too, we had to memorize poems.
Oh yeah.
So they've gotten away from doing that, but it is a real lesson, and it's something that we always did. We had to memorize a poem and get up and recite it. And I remember 8th graders in North Adams Public Schools always had to learn the Gettysburg Address.
Yeah.
And then the winner, it was like a contest, the winner said it at Memorial Day, you know, so poetry has always been a piece of the fabric of American literature. And I remember I have a poster at home that Kennedy is saying that a man who doesn't spend time with poems has not really learned to educate himself, that sort of thing. So the other thing we were talking about, though, what's the function of poetry as far as the skill for someone who's not sure they want to spend time with a poem or try to figure it out? What good is poetry in, say, the workplace? What skill does poetry analysis give you?
I think for me, as I was thinking about, as learning poetry myself, not that I'm well versed in poetry, but in the poems that I have read, the poems that I do read, the imagery is really, you have to really use your brain to kind of think about what the poet is referring to. So it helps, for me, it helped develop critical thinking skills, really that careful, close reading they talk about in language arts now in reading. is becoming an active, I call it an active reader. You have to really engage with the text so that you're able to get the vision of what the poet's talking about without having maybe a picture in front of you, because a lot of times it's just the text.
Yeah.
And there's nothing to refer to, so you have to be able to envision what they're talking about when two roads diverge in the woods. What are you thinking about? And it's the two roads splitting off, and as it goes through the poem, it talks about different aspects of the journey. And it appears that they're talking about walking down a country road, but as you really read that, it's more or less your journey and what road you took to get to where you currently are, or where you want to be. So it's looking for that piece that connects to your current situation, maybe in life, or helps you kind of figure out where you're going. So I find that poetry has been helpful in analytical thinking and critical reading, really engaging actively as a reader.
Yeah, it's for English teachers and whatnot. It's combining and then choosing right word choice. We talk about that when you're looking at an essay, but a poem, as I say, there's so many things that, and there's been studies how a poem and the sound of a poem can resonate in your brain, and it brings back a certain memory. So it could be a rose, a flower, the smell of a rose. It could be a color that brings you back to a certain memory. So there's more involved in a poem, and the poet knows this. He or she is writing perhaps from their own experience. So in a way, they're like scientists. They're observing the world. They're seeing, smelling, touching, tasting, what's the other one? But the five sentences. Five senses, but then it moves you past that 1 minute of observation, and it can bring your brain back to those feelings you had when you first saw that, or some memory.
Yeah.
So it's deeper, I guess I'd say. It goes deeper into our own makeup. And it brings back things that happened in the past, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of poems that have been turned into songs.
Yes.
That have been turned into music over the years, and that that's one way to look at it. I think one of the nice things now is I know when I taught Robert Frost's poem "The Two Roads Diverged in the Woods," I was able to go online and find actually a recording of him reading the poem.
That's even better.
With some vision. So it was nice to now be able to hear the poet reading his own work and get his feeling, but then you could hear another poet or another, reader reading the poem and see if the feelings are the same.
Yes.
And I think, because I know when I read poetry, some of it I have the feeling in there, some of it maybe not right off the bat. So
Right.
it's that ability to understand reading the verses in the poetry and thinking about each verse.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say too, if you're going to be in a classroom and you've been given an assignment of a poem, it's to read it out loud.
Yeah.
If you can't get the actual poet recorded
Right.
reading his own poem, you read it out loud even if you're by yourself, because it's meant to be read out loud, and you'll get a sense perhaps of, as you said, there is a rhythm to it. That's why it fits nicely with music. The other thing, of course, is that different poems are the cup of tea for different people.
Right.
It's like if you were going to choose the kind of music you like. You might not like all kinds of music, but there's a specific kind of music that draws you to it, and that's the same way with poetry. So I would say historically, poetry has always seemed to be written about nature, and then they move into different emotions like love or hate or things like that. Nowadays, you can have poets that actually write about the universe and the stars, anything that you can think of. We were talking about is that poetry? Yeah, I would say it's poetry. Even though you're talking about, the popo or whatever, you're using the slang and things like that.
Event or something.
Yeah, but it's an observation by the poet, and it's their impression of what's happening to them in a certain time frame, So, so I guess we'll get to some examples of the poetry we have. And up here on the whiteboard, I did put a picture of some spring flowers that, oops, let me pull this thing to me. Okay, whoops. There we go. All right, so here's some little crocus. I actually took a walk last spring, over at the old spruces, and the whole place was just coming to life, and here was just a small little group of flowers, some crocus. And to me, they're like the first sign of spring when you see that purple, and they really are displayed at springtime. Some of the other things that poets have written poems about, obviously, are also nature. Here's a very brilliant, the colors too in the spring, after we've had the whiteness of the snow and the cold and the damp and the frost and ice. It's nice to think that the monarchs are going to be coming back, and there's going to be huge displays of flowers as we go forward into summer. So remember these images, because after I show you some of our spring poems, there will be an assignment for our class after, and I'll share that in a few minutes with you. The main thing I want to start our lesson today with is the vocabulary terms that are used when you're analyzing poetry. So the very first one is figurative language. And when we have figurative language, if there's a poem that, let me use an example of an apple. So an apple, we know, is a red fruit. You bite into it, it's white. There's seeds in an apple. It grows on a tree. But when you use figurative language in a poem, and an apple shows up in a poem, not only is it a red fruit, but it could represent the original sin when Eve offered that apple to Adam. And it can be seen as a symbol of sin or temptation. And that's why figurative language has more than one meaning, more than the literal meaning. The next term is the literal language. And so in literal language, it is what it is. It's an apple. And there's no big mystery about it. You're just saying, I need to buy some apples at the supermarket today. And you're not talking about sin or anything else. You're just talking, that's what I need to get. With poetry, we use the term stanza and line, not paragraph and sentence. So when you go down through a poem, you look for the breaks in the poem, because that usually is how poems define that stanza, that group of words that causes the first section of a poem. And each line is not a sentence, it's a line. So you use the term stanza and line when you're looking at a poem and explaining it. Two things that you should know that are used not only in poetry, but it could be in prose, but a lot of prose uses it also, but definitely there are metaphors and similes in a poem. And a metaphor compares two different things. You could say she is cold, she's an ice cube. And that could mean that you're saying she's just really cold and unfeeling, that sort of thing. But if you said she is cold as ice, where you're using as or like, that's a simile. So either way, you're comparing two different things. You're comparing a woman to an ice cube, this sort of thing. So again, simile, you use like or as. Metaphor, you're comparing two things as though something, you're just saying that is that. These two that come up next, I'll be pointing out them. Alliteration is kind of a fun word to say, but alliteration uses two or more words that start with the same sound or letter. If I write a sentence, now this is a sentence, not a line, but we could say, we walked wearily down the highway. You can hear I'm using W's, and I'm purposely choosing them so I can hear that W sound. We walked wearily down the highway. So that's alliteration, when you're using two or more words in a sentence or a line, and it gives the poem or that line that sound that the poet would want. Personification is fun. It's giving human qualities to objects. So if you said something like the trees danced in the wind, we know that trees don't dance, but if the wind is moving them around and a poet thinks of it as a dance with them waving their branches and things, trees don't wave their branches, the wind is moving their branches, but we give human qualities to objects, and that's called personification. A rhyme is something that most of us expect in a poem. The very first poems, after February, Valentine's Day is where I can remember hearing the first few poems when I was younger. Roses are red, violets are blue. And then, of course, the kids take over and say, I kissed a cow and thought it was you, this sort of thing. But there's been a lot of poems that always rhymed at the end of either the first two lines, or there's a certain rhyme scheme in those poems where there's an effort to have the end words rhyme. Free verse I don't have down here, but all poems don't have to rhyme. It's basically, what is the picture that comes to mind when you read these poems, and how do you feel about the words choices that have been chosen to make you feel or remember something in a certain way. The last term that I want to use is hyperbole. That's how it's pronounced, hyperbole, and that's an exaggeration. So if somebody says, I could eat a horse, obviously you're not going to eat a horse, you're just really hungry. And that would be an example of figurative language. It isn't what you said, it's what you're trying to present, that you're very, very hungry. So if you do something like that, it can be called hyperbole. So those are some terms that we will use if we're going to examine and analyze some of these poems. So the first poem that I want to show you is this poem, and it's by Christina Rossetti. And let me get this. It's called Spring, sort of appropriate for our theme today. And this lady her husband was very famous. You may or may not have heard of the pre-Raphaelites. Let me fold this down. But they were a group of painters, and they had very beautiful paintings. And I often think of some of their paintings that were done. This is her husband's painting of Christina Rossetti. So beautiful girl with auburn hair, but she herself was a poet. And this is a painting, one of the paintings he did of her. He used her in a lot of paintings. She's in this painting that is a spiritual theme, the Annunciation. That's Christina Rossetti, if you ever, and his name was Dante Rossetti. So if you see some of these paintings with this woman's image, she was a beautiful woman, and his And I'm trying to think, I'm saying her husband, but they were brother and sister, actually. Brother and sister. So this is her poem about spring. And I want you to, while I'm reading this out loud, my suggestion is to read a poem out loud, and then you go back in and look at it. So just read the whole thing straight through, and then you go back in to analyze it. So you get a sense of what the setting is for the poem. So it's called Spring. Frost locked all winter, seeds and roots and stones of fruits. What shall make their sap ascend, that they may put forth shoots? Tips of tender green, leaf or blade or sheath, telling of the hidden life that breaks forth underneath. Life nursed in its grave by death. Blows the thaw wind pleasantly, drips the soaking rain. By fits looks down the waking sun. Young grass springs on the plain. Young leaves clothe early hedgerows trees. Seeds and roots and stones of fruits, swollen with sap, put forth their shoots. Curled-headed ferns sprout in the lane. Birds sing and pair again. There is no time like spring, when life's alive in everything. Before new nestlings sing, before cleft swallows speed their journey back among the trackless track, God guides their wing. He spreads their table that they nothing lack. Before the daisy grows a common flower, before the sun has power to scorch the world up in his noontide hour, there is no time like spring. So let me just point out a couple of things in this poem. So generally it's her observation of spring. There's not a lot of hidden things in here, but there are a few lines and word choices that you have to see that it's not just describing everything becoming reborn, as we know spring to be. She also repeats a couple of lines. She repeats the second line, seeds and roots and stones of fruits. And even though, if I say it again, seeds and roots and stones of fruits, it's sort of a rhyme within a line, and that's called an internal rhyme. Roots and fruits are not clear rhymes, but they sound sort of the same. They sort of make a sound that is interesting to hear. She also uses that down further in the poem, but the very last line of the first stanza, it says, life nursed in its grave by death. And if I was in a classroom, I would say, what is that? What do you think that means? Why would she now put death into this poem with a capital D? Want to suggest what you think it means?
Yeah, I think what she's referring to is spring results from the previous season's death.
Yeah.
The death of summer leads to the life that is spring. So the death that she's referring to is the death prior to winter, or over the winter to the spring.
Yeah. And it's like, actually I didn't finish the poem. I should finish the poem. But at this point, we're being told, it's almost, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Spring is also the time of Easter. So a lot of the poems refer to God and God's resurrection. And that's the rest of this poem, and I do apologize. This is the one that stuck, and this is how the poem ends. There's that line again. Seeds and roots and stones of fruits, swollen with sap, put forth their shoots. curlied head, ferns sprout in the lane, birds sing and pair again. There is no time like spring when life's alive in everything. Before new nestlings sing, before cleft swallow. Did I already read this? I don't know. I think I did. It's this one I need to say. Here it is. Like spring that passes by, there is no life like spring life, born to die. Piercing the sod, clothing the uncouth clod, hatched in the nest, fledged on the windy bough, strong on the wing, there is no time like spring that passes by, now newly born and now hastening to die. So that gives you that hit in the end, that basically everything's being reborn, everything is brand new, new shoots of grass coming out of their earthly grave through the winter time. And it says, like spring that passes by. This is not going to last forever.
No.
And there is no life like spring life, born to die. So it's a reality check almost by the last stanza. And she's not with hope though, without hope. Because she says they're all being born from that earthly death, and then they come back after. So there's hope after death, and that's part of the pre-Raphaelites. They're always talking about death and dying, and it's a time period when Christina wrote that there's the word melancholy. There's always some happy thoughts, but then they say, yeah, but. Something else.
That but the end.
Something could happen. There's always a but, right? In the end. All right, so that's Christina Rossetti. And let me now give you another this is a newer poet. This is one of his quotes, and then I'll give you a poem that he wrote. His name is Billy Collins. And this is his quote about poetry. He says, one of the ridiculous aspects of being a poet is the huge gulf between how seriously we take ourselves and how generally we are ignored by everybody else. So that's the life of a poet, according to Billy Collins. And he's written quite a few books of poetry. And I really have to look more into him, because here's one of his poems that he wrote about spring, and he calls it Today. So we're looking for his observations and also his feelings. And I've really taken to this poem because it surprised me. So I'm going to read it through one time, and you try to guess the part where it just stopped me cold in my tracks. So again, Today by Billy Collins. If ever there were a spring day so perfect, so uplifted by a warm intermittent breeze that it made you want to throw open all the windows in the house and unlatch the door to the canary's cage, indeed, rip the little door from its jamb, a day when the cool brick paths in the garden bursting with peonies seemed so etched in sunlight that you felt like taking a hammer to the glass paperweight on the living room table, releasing the inhabitants from their snow-covered cottage so they could walk out holding hands and squinting into this larger dome of blue and white. Well, today is just that kind of day. So let me just show you a little picture of what he's talking about when he says a paperweight. This is what I believe he's talking about. He's talking about a snow globe. So I'm sure most of you have seen a snow globe, and you take it and you shake it and it makes snow, little glitter things, some of them, and they come down. There's this little snow-covered cottage. But that's the part of the poem that kind of took me back, because he's talking about how wonderful the day is, and it's a spring day. It's a perfect spring day, and he's suggesting that it's just such a beautiful day outside, and that warm breeze is outside, and we sort of get a glimpse about what he's feeling inside. He says, did you ever have that kind of a day where you wanted to throw open all the windows? How many of you have already done that on a few of the sunny days we've had, and the weather was almost up into the 70s, just to get some air from the outside into the house? And people were starting to put their screens down or up, either way. And then he's also giving us a metaphor. He's saying that you unlatch the door to the canary's cage. He doesn't just unlatch the canary cage, he rips the little door from its jamb. So, and think about this. If you took this literally, he's got all the windows open in the house. He rips the door off the canary cage, and where's the canary going to go? Out the window, right? But then he talks a little about the garden path, and the bricks are cool out there, and it's a beautiful backyard. He's talking about peonies, which are those big puffy pink flowers that have a beautiful aroma. But then he takes a hammer to the glass of the paperweight on the living room end table. And that kind of surprised me. I was sort of sitting back and saying, okay, he's talking about spring and how it makes him feel, and he's appreciating the warm breeze. But he's thinking, have you wanted to break open a snow globe and let those little people in that make-believe house inside get out? Now, why would he even write a poem like this? It's got figurative language. We know he's observing a spring day. He's feeling the warm breeze. But I would suggest that he is feeling that nervous tension that I'm sure all of us could identify with. We've been sort of cooped up with COVID and with various things through the winter and everything. And you get in a state, well, there is a term, cabin fever. Some of us are experiencing that. And the only word I could come up with is I think he wants us to see the tension he's feeling of wanting to get out and get into nature, into a better weather climate, being able to just break free. And he lets us know how that would feel if he could let the canary out of the cage, if he could let those people that are in that imaginary little house in the snow-covered snow globe out. And of course, they're not real. But he's giving us those images that not only does he want to get out, but he wants to free everybody else that's feeling the way he does. So not only is he explaining what he sees and feels and thinks about his spring day, he's also giving us the feeling of how tense and nervous he feels because he really doesn't know where to put himself. And we've all had that kind of feeling where I just don't know what to do with myself today. I've had enough of watching television. I've had enough of not being able to go to a movie theater or go out to eat and things like that. You could put that in the same kind of feeling that he's telling us two things. He's telling about the spring day, but he's also saying how nervous and edgy he feels that day. And that he really brings home because it sounds like a violent act to rip off the cage of the canary cage and to break the glass snow globe to let the inhabitants out, to free them from being cooped up. So that's Billy Collins's spring poem. Now this poet, I'm going to do one more, and then Bob's going to show you a couple of other poems. This one is called Miracle on St. David's Day. And this woman, you may or may not have heard from, but her name is Gillian Clark, and she's sort of the poet laureate for Wales, the country Wales. I liked her quote when I went looking, and she said, "Poetry is a hook for memory." And I think we can safely say that that's true. If a poem means anything to you, and as I said, haven't you ever had a nervous, tense day like that where you didn't know what to do with yourself? When you read a poem like that, you can recall those days and how you felt. And so that's the real thing. When you start figuring out the puzzle of a poem, it should have something that you can identify with in your own memory. And then it becomes a poem that you can remember a line or a word from, and you can make it your own. This is a woman that now is in her 80s, and she too is a woman that has written quite a few poetry books. She's also she's still teaching poetry classes over in Wales, and this is her poem. And let me say a little bit about this poem. And this rang true to me because I had sort of an experience like this myself. So the name of the poem is called "Miracle on St. David's Day." And she quotes from William Wordsworth's poem, The Daffodils. "They flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude." And she's read his springtime poem about finding the daffodils, and Bob's going to share that with you in a few minutes. But now she's talking about the daffodils she sees and in Wales. And you may or may not know this, but St. David's Day is a big day in Wales. And St. David is like the saint of Wales. You'll see on the Welsh flag, you'll see a dragon, you'll see daffodils, and you'll see leeks, those onions, the big leek onions, you know. Those are the three things that Wales is known for. And St. David, the reason for the dragon is St. George is known to have slain a dragon. But St. David, apparently according to legend in Wales, he went and talked to the dragon and said, "Why are you setting our villages on fire? What do you need?" And he talked him out of it. So that's St. David, but it's always celebrated on March 1st. So it's a springtime festival, and they make leek and potato soup on that occasion. And they also, it's the same time that daffodils are coming out in Wales. And this is something she did on St. David's Day. So let's hear what happened and how she experienced the miracle on St. David's Day. An afternoon, yellow and open-mouthed with daffodils, the sun treads the path among cedars and enormous oaks. It might be a country house, guests strolling, the rumps of gardeners between nursery shrubs. I am reading poetry to the insane. An old woman, interrupting, offers as many buckets of coal as I need. A beautiful chestnut-haired boy listens entirely absorbed. A schizophrenic on a good day, they tell me later. In a cage of first March sun, a woman sits not listening, not seeing, not feeling. In her neat clothes, the woman herself is absent. A big, mild man is tenderly led to his chair. He has never spoken. His laborer's hands on his knees, he rocks gently to the rhythms of the poems. I read to their presences, absences, to the big, dumb, laboring man as he rocks. He is suddenly standing silently, huge and mild, but I feel afraid, like slow movement of spring water or the first bird of the year in the breaking darkness. The laborer's voice recites the daffodils. The nurses are frozen, alert. The patients seem to listen. He is hoarse but word perfect. Outside, the daffodils are still as wax, 1,000, 10,000. Their syllables unspoken, their creams and yellows still. 40 years ago, in a valley school, the class recited poetry by rote. Since the dumbness of misery fell, he has remembered there was a music of speech, and that once he had something to say. When he's done, before the applause, we observe the flowers' silence. A thrush sings, and the daffodils are flame. So I hope you can understand what's happened here. This woman, Jillian Clark, went to a home for the mentally ill, and she was there to read them some of her poetry, and unbeknownst to her, this one man that the staff said had never spoken, when she starts talking about something in her poems, it jarred a memory in his, and he had memorized the daffodil poem as a young man, and he said the first words he had said in many years. And I do, when I used to be with the local historical society here, I remember we used to travel to nursing homes around, or daycare centers for the elderly. And we brought some exhibits sometimes with pictures of the mills and the inside shots of the mills and whatnot. And we even brought one shuttlecock, and those shuttles have a metal tip on both ends of them so that when they fly in the loom back and forth, they hit the side. And this one woman, again, who had never talked, didn't want to talk to anybody, she started to cry, and she said, it made an awful noise. And it was just a memory, and I wasn't doing poetry at the time, but one photo really brought that all back to her, the sounds of working in the mill and different things. So it's our memories are there, even if we're not voicing that we remember things, they're there. So poetry can bring those back. So Bob has agreed to read the daffodil poem, and that poem is by this man, William Wordsworth, and it is called the Daffodils. So, okay.
Get that one here. So this is, I wandered lonely as a cloud, and this was written by William Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 I saw at a glance, tossing their heads in springly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jounced company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the shew to me had brought. For oft would I on my couch lie, in vacant and in pensive mood, they flashed upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
You can actually picture that. I think of a couple of times I've been hiking on Mount Greylock, and you'll all of a sudden come onto a field of, they may not be daffodils, but flowers that just go on endlessly and do their dance.
Yeah.
And how calming that can be to do, to just be in that scene. So there's a lot of imagery
Yes.
in this particular poem.
Yeah. And I would even say that the color yellow
Yeah.
at this time of the year it's just such, it seems happy.
Yeah.
It seems like a happy
Yeah,
color,
it's a happy
you know?
color. You notice that.
And that's why a lot of people will be changing their colors of the clothes they're wearing
Yeah.
too, you know, sometimes.
People change their colors.
So that's definitely a springtime poem that is really just, but again, it's not just talking about the daffodils.
No,
He has a couple of lines in there, and does this man could you read the first line?
Yeah. I wandered lonely as a cloud.
So the idea of being lonely as a cloud is a perfect example of personification
Yeah.
and simile, because clouds lonely. You know, that's
Right.
He's using figurative language for that. But the idea, when you start out the poem and he's saying, I'm wandering lonely as a cloud, it doesn't sound like he's got any purpose that day.
Right.
He's just
Yeah,
wandering
absolutely.
around and enjoying nature maybe. But you do question, is he happy he's by himself? But when you get back to the end of the line, what does he say when he's on the couch?
It says, for oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils.
So I'm not so sure he doesn't like his solitude.
Yeah.
Because you can imagine if he was out walking with a friend, a companion, that they'd be talking and maybe miss the beauty of the daffodils or something, you know what I mean? So,
Yeah,
some
almost-
people are happy when they have a moment alone. They're not lonely as a cloud.
Right.
But he sounds, by the end of that poem, that it was just such a nice moment where he had a companion and it was nature.
Yeah, and I think we all have that need for solitude
Yes.
at different times. We need to have our own time as much as we need that time with others.
Yes.
We need that time, and I think that's what he's referring to is, you know, as he was laying in that pensive mood or vacant mood on his couch,
Yeah.
all of a sudden the daffodils filled his inward eye, his mind's eye, and then with the daffodils he danced.
Yeah.
So he felt that pleasure of being in that field of daffodils again.
Yeah, I think that's why it's been, that's a poem that most of us memorized
Yeah.
when we were younger. As I say, they don't really do that
No.
anymore, but it could be.
Yeah.
The next poem that Bob's going to read is a poem by Robert Frost, another poem by Robert Frost. He's the same one that Bob was talking about before, the two roads. What is the name of that poem? Two roads
diverge in the
diverge
woods, I
in
think.
the woods or something. Yeah.
You'd have to look at it.
But this one is Nothing Gold Can Stay, and so if you could read that poem.
Yeah. So nothing gold could stay. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so for an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay.
So the very first time I ever saw that poem was when I taught The Outsiders in 7th grade.
That's right.
And in The Outsiders, which we talked about earlier this year, it is talking about the fact, and it says, nature's first leaf is gold. Is that the
Yeah,
first line?
nature's first green is gold.
Green, the first green is gold. So if you think about when the buds first come out, they're not green leaves. They come out as gold. And the poem starts with an actual observation by Robert Frost, and he spent a lot of time outside, and he also had something about building a wall between
he's
neighbors
a
and things like that. I like a lot of his images. But this is a bud when it first comes out, and it's gold, and it doesn't stay gold long, because then it turns into, this is an apple tree branch, then it does become the apple leaf. So, but it starts out gold. So that's what he's actually giving us a scientific observation of what he sees when buds first come out on an apple tree. But then the poem itself, would you like to talk about what it's also saying? Not just the observation.
I think it's saying that it's fleeting in time, that, it's, here it says, her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour.
Yeah.
So it's not going to stay gold. The gold is going to go away. We're going to get the flower, and then the flower is going to go away, and eventually the tree will die, come back to life again. So that gold doesn't stay all season long. It's only for a short period of time.
And the idea of something gold is it has a value to it. That gold or silver, both are supposed to be, a symbol of wealth, perhaps. But it also, the way they used it in The Outsiders was that all the outsiders in that book and in that movie by S.E. Hinton, they were young. Yeah. And they and it by the end of the movie, 3 are dead, because of the circumstances they lived in and bad choices and things like that. So most of these spring poems have that little hint that it's not going to last forever. Yeah. So you better appreciate every single day. Yeah. Not so much that I can't even explain it well. I need to write a poem about it. But the idea that it's not hitting you over the head with a lesson, you must do this, you must live appreciating every day. It's just an observation by Robert Frost or by Gillian Clark or these other poets that say, I realize that nothing lasts forever, but I'm going to enjoy this great spring day when I see it. Yeah, and
I think even the spring poems in particular, they can refer to a particular situation you're going through. Yeah, that it's not going to last forever. So to see
that too, the bad times
are not going to last forever. No. So to keep that in mind as well, and it's a kind of a, I don't say allegory, but a correlation that nothing is permanent. Right. In many instances.
So I'm going to give you a little assignment. Let me go back to the whiteboard, and I want you to hear our assignment for class. These were some examples. You can look again at this this airing on YouTube. You know that, right? And you're going to go on North Berkshire Adult Education or the Northern Berkshire Community Television Corporation website on YouTube, and this is your assignment. I want you to think of an object, a thing in your house, but preferably outside, if you can get outside, and it's springtime now, and you're going to think about what this object is that you're looking at. So I did bring a few things that you might see when you're outside. It could be that bud off the tree. I filmed this last spring. I had a young buck come right across the street in front of my house. And he had, I did personify him in many, many ways. He had 2 fawns with him. They're up here. And it was almost like he was babysitting the fawns. Yeah. And he just went about eating, and all of a sudden the fawns came across the road and were on my side of the street. But it was just kind of funny. I've never seen a buck babysitting fawns, but they were certainly too much for him to handle. He wasn't even watching them. But anyway, you can go outside. You could find a really pretty flower. You could find a rock. And you're going to start your poem as though you were in the middle of something. And you can use words that suggest, like, all of a sudden I saw this, or something like that. And I want you to write as fast as you can words that come to you when you see this thing that catches your eye. and just write it down. Don't worry about whether it's a stanza break or a line or whatever. Look at your observations of this one thing out in nature and get down to your feelings about it. Use your senses. What do you see, smell, taste, touch, feel about it? And then when you go back into your house, remember what you saw the next day. And then I want you to then imagine what this object could represent to a person who was reading it who didn't see it when you saw it. So we're going to just play around with your observations, and I do want you to think one thing that you felt about it. Use your next sense if you want. How did you feel after you made the observations? How did it make you feel to see that? So let me see if there's anything else I need to ask you. I guess the other thing would be if you've ever seen something like that before, or if it reminded you of a person you knew, another day where you saw something like this with another person, things like that. So bring in your memory, and we'll talk about how that poem would be constructed. Any other thoughts, Bob?
Well, I think that was you did a nice job, and I think as we said, poetry itself might not be inviting to start, but when you get into it, you start to think of the other applications that it carries across learning, across life. I know poetry is part of the HiSET test, which we talk about a lot. At some point, we will share some more specific information about that. But you talked about verse and stanza, and in a lot of that, it's referring to specific verses or stanzas within the poem when you're looking at that information. So it's it's finding the thing that best captures an image for you within a particular piece of poetry, or maybe even a stanza or a verse within the poem that sticks out. Oftentimes when I'm reading it, one day I'll read it and it'll strike this memory, the next day this memory. So it's a different experience every time you engage with the text. So I think it's like I said, I'm a very big person on being an active participant in your learning. So think about how whatever you're learning, you can engage with the text, become an active participant in what you're doing, and that makes it more interesting because you're giving it a personal spin when you're studying something. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, agreed. So thanks for joining us today, and maybe poetry is in your future, at least an appreciation of different kinds of poems. But again, when you have something that strikes you as important, write it down in your journal. It could become your own poem someday. So we're looking forward to seeing what you can do. Thanks for coming.